guys so much, and let me say, you know, I travel all over the country. There's only a couple places that I really do feel at home, and Northborough is absolutely one of them. I've been here for years and years, and you guys are always first in my heart. So this time around, John calls me and asks me to talk about why Bernie Sanders is popular and why he's wrong. And I, in a way, am uniquely qualified to discuss this because I went to high school just down the road in Amherst, Massachusetts, and then I attended University of Massachusetts in Amherst. I think every bit of formal education that I have received in my entire life was in the town of Amherst, Massachusetts, which is right up there with Berkeley as one of the most left-wing towns in all of America. And my history, history was my subject, it was my favorite subject. I love history. Everything that I learned in American history was essentially the history of American socialists. That's what they taught us. They taught us about Emma Goldman and Eugene Debs and Charles Beard and John Reed, and it was a litany of all the great socialists of America and successful people all, and I realized what they had in common with Bernie Sanders, and it's very simple and it's very important. They were never in power. That's it. That is the secret to being a successful socialist, is to never actually be in power. If you never put these things into effect, you get to be all salesmanship and zero delivery. And that's perfect, because socialism wins the salesmanship battle every single time. Capitalism's hard. You listen to capitalists like me, and I'm going to tell you, capitalism is going to make you work hard. You're going to get up early in the morning and compete with your competitors and stay up late and lower prices, and you're going to have to fight and struggle to move things ahead. Whereas the socialists tell you, oh, it'll be a piece of cake. We'll take care of everything. You can just relax and stay in bed all day, and everything will be fine. Salesmanship is everything. And then if you never achieve a power as a socialist and you die, for 100 years, your followers will be talking about how great things would have been. If only you had come to power, if only Eugene Debs had won that darn presidential election back in 1912 or whatever it was, then everything would have been perfect. And as long as that's what they're saying, you will have a great biography and go down in history as a hero of socialism. On the other hand, if you talk to the people of Venezuela, or the people of Brazil, or the people of Cuba, how well socialism's been working for them, you're not going to get such a bright answer. So what I want to talk about is a little bit about what socialism is, and a little bit of why it really can't work, even on its own terms, although, you know, as pipe dreams go, it's as beautiful as any. So, again, back when I was in school, we were taught that communism was all the way on the left, and Nazism, fascism, was all the way on the right, and we were in the middle. If you go too far to the right, you're going to bump into Hitler. If you go too far to the left, you're going to bump into Stalin, and it's a good thing to stay right in the middle. And I had trouble with this concept even in high school. It bothered me. It seemed like the communists and the Nazis had a whole lot in common to be the absolute opposite of each other. And my teacher said, well, you know, opposites are frequently similar. Now I understand, or not. And moreover, you add Hitler plus Stalin and divide by 2, you get the United States of America. Really? Really? Does that make sense? And I knew it was wrong. It was years and years and years before I discovered what was right. Because there actually is a spectrum. It's just a different spectrum. The actual true spectrum of political, economic options, if you will, actually works like this. On one side of the spectrum, you have what is correctly called collectivism. And collectivism, by its very nature, comes in a million different flavors. Because collectivism, very simply, is where one person imposes his will on all of society. And that's all it is. And how many different people could be imposing their wills? A million different people who could be in the position to impose his will on everybody else. And then there's a million different flavors. Okay? So there's no question that Hitler's vision and Stalin's vision and a million other collectivists have a slightly different vision, but what they all have in common is it's about imposing their will. Bernie Sanders wants to impose his vision of what things ought to be on everybody else, because that's all collectivism is. You can dress it up in as fancy names and terms as you want. It's one person's vision and whatever. Well, Hitler had a vision too. And I'm not here to tell you that Hitler's vision and Bernie Sanders' vision are the same vision. They're clearly not. They were clearly different visions. But what they have in common is in both cases, they have the moral certitude to believe that their set of priorities of how the world ought to be, is worthy of being imposed on everybody else in society, whether the other people in society want it or don't want it. That's what it is. Okay? And you can say, well, I like his vision, I don't like his vision, which if we had Bernie Sanders here, that's what he'd say. He'd say, my vision is good, and Hitler's vision was bad. And I have no doubt that he'd agree with that, but I'm also sure if we brought Hitler here, he would say, my vision is good, and Bernie Sanders' vision is bad. Because that's all there is. What's the opposite of this? The opposite is a society-based individualism, where individual people make their own decisions about their own lives and their own priorities. And it's interesting because that's what capitalism is. It's individual people making their own decisions in pretty much every area. And obviously, I can't get into all the technical details, but obviously there are certain limitations. You can't murder people, you can't steal stuff. There's certain limits to what you can do. But as long as you're not hurting people or stealing stuff, you can run your life the way you want. Capitalism is not a system. It's simply the absence of force. If you don't force people to follow somebody else's will, what you got is capitalism. And capitalism changes all the time. It's not one thing, it's everything, where nobody has the power to force other people to do what they don't want to do. Bingo, that's it. And it's complex, and yet it's so simple. That's it, where you've got the million different kinds of collectivism, because then it's a question of whose will is being imposed. And if we understand that, there's a couple ramifications that go along with that. One is that socialists do not have, and I'm saying it very broadly, I mean the entire left of the political spectrum, does not have principles. And I'm not saying that I disagree with their principles. I'm saying there are no principles. There are none. And it's very important to understand that. The word principle actually means something. It's not just some random word. It has a meaning. A principle is something that applies all the time to everybody. That's what makes it a principle. If it applies sometimes when you feel like it, and other times when it doesn't apply because you don't feel like it, that's not a principle anymore. And it's very important to understand the left does not have principles. None. Elizabeth Warren, I presume you're familiar with. Elizabeth Warren gave a speech about a year and a half ago where she listed the 11 principles of liberalism. And if you Google that, you'll find 9,000 press accounts of it. It was a huge hit at the time. The entire left-wing journalistic world was swooning over these 11 principles of liberalism that our hero Elizabeth Warren has defined. And I read them very carefully. The most salient point is that none of them are principles. Or principles aren't principles. She says that CEOs should get paid less, and McDonald's workers should get paid more. Well, that's not a principle. Okay? You have a desired outcome, but there's no principle. Okay? You know, we're back to like, you know, Hitlerian kind of principles. You know, and by the way, the Nazis actually codified this stuff. You know, in occupied Poland, you know, their concept was that the poorest German, ethnic German in Poland, had to be richer than the richest Pole. Okay, that was the Poles all had to be down here, and the Germans had to be up here, because that's what we're about, is the German, and of course the Jews, you need to be all killed, they couldn't be there at all. That's not our principle. That's just, I like my guys, I don't like your guys. Okay, that's all it is. And you could say that there's a principle of equality, that they believe in equality, but it's not true. I was reading just the other day on the Drudge Report how Hillary Clinton, giving her speech about income inequality, was wearing a $30,000 shirt. Yeah. Did you catch that one? That's you know, and the fact that she's too tone deaf to even, you know, think that one through is just breathtaking. But the very early socialists, it was about 10 minutes in the first half of the 19th century when socialists actually believed in literal equality. You find some early socialists who said every single person in society is going to make $45,000 a year. You could be the head of General Motors, you could be the guy sweeping the floor at General Motors, it doesn't matter, $45,000 a year for everybody, no matter what, and that is literal equality. But the socialists gave up on it very, very quickly, and you never hear them talk about this anymore, because it's got huge problems. And again, this is part of the nature of being a socialist, is that they don't understand how an economy actually works. Okay? They're going to improve it, but they don't understand where, kind of like if I would say to you, you know, I'm going to make your car get 100 miles to the gallon. But I don't know how your car works now. Right? I don't know how your car turns gasoline into motion. But put me in power and I'll make it get 100 miles a gallon. Okay? How is that going to work? So they don't understand this stuff, and they miss two huge points. Again, if you ask them, you can press the socialists all you want, they will not go back to this, because they even understand why this is totally impractical. The first problem is that you can't let people choose their own career if everyone gets paid the same. Because what happens naturally, inherently in any market, is that prices allocate resources to where they're needed, right? If there's more of a demand for aluminum than we've got aluminum, and there's less of a demand for copper, then the price of aluminum goes up and the price of copper goes down, and that's how we distribute things. That's how we change people's behavior. Well, the same thing is true of salaries. If there's too many teachers and not enough nurses, salaries for teachers go down, salaries for nurses go up, and people will start moving into the other profession because the price reallocates where things go. That's the job of pricing. How would that work in a society where everybody makes $45,000 a year? I mean, if that's the society we live in, I am going to be a poet. You all can dig the ditches and chop down the trees and pave the roads and fix the broken plumbing. I'm writing poetry. Everyone's getting $45,000 a year. Doesn't just send it over to my place, and I'll be at my desk, you know, in a nice air-conditioned room writing poetry. You can't have that. You must therefore force people into professions they don't want to be in. If everyone's getting $45,000 a year, the government must necessarily say, you will be a plumber, doesn't matter what your hopes and dreams are, we need you as a plumber, and that's it, the conversation's over. That's the first problem. The second problem is, what do you do with the slackers? There's going to be slackers.
That's what it is.
Perhaps, but at the bare minimum, if you have to pay everybody the exact same amount of money, regardless of whether they're doing a good job or a bad job or a mediocre job, you have to, and I challenge you to come up with an alternative to this, you have to beat them. I mean, that's the only way. If you can't address people's good or bad economic behavior through economic incentives, which is how an economy normally works, Then I got to pay you 45 because that's the law, no matter what. And what do I do with the guy who comes in late every day? I've got to beat him. You must use corporal punishment. If you don't, I can't think of any other option. I don't think there is any other option. And if this all sounds familiar, you don't get to choose what you do. You get beaten if you don't do it. This is called a slave plantation. This is like we've gone full circle. We've just reinvented slavery. And the socialists at some point 200 years ago said, oh my gosh, we accidentally reinvented slavery. We're forcing people to do what they don't want to do, and then we beat them if they don't do what we tell them. Okay? So the socialists said, well, we can't have that. So we're not going to exactly pay everybody equally. We're gonna pay them more fairly. We're going to be more rational. This crazy market, pays people all kinds of crazy amounts of money. We're not going to pay people the same, but we're going to have a more rational system, which is simply back to the point I made about Bernie Sanders to begin with. It simply is a matter of imposing his version of what people ought to get paid. There was another piece, this was years ago on Drudge, about the highest paid government worker in the country. There's this guy who runs a secret facility in Colorado to come up with alternative energy. And he gets paid $1 million a year. It's a government worker, he gets paid $1 million a year to produce, but he doesn't produce alternative energy because as far as I can tell, nothing's ever come out of this. He just gets paid to look for it. Because the people running the government think that that's very valuable. Okay, even though it doesn't actually produce any value for anything. His assistant makes $700,000 a year. Okay? So they don't have a problem with millionaires and millionaires as long as you're doing what they think you should be doing. Again, it is simply somebody's will. There is no principles at all. The other thing that's worth noting is that they are inherently perfectionists. That is, say, we capitalists get to say, perfection's not going to happen. Human beings are not perfect. I've never met a perfect human being in my entire life. Things will never come out perfect. That's just the way it is. Because the whole mission of socialists is to say, well, we can always do it better because our system is implied perfect. All they do is find flaw, whatever they don't like in the current society and say, well, the people going hungry, and that's imperfect. So therefore we have to have socialism. People, as this guy's getting paid too little, he can't afford all the stuff he wants to buy, so that's imperfect, and therefore we have to have socialism. So the second characteristic of socialism and all collectivism is this implied perfectionism, that anything that's not perfect is unacceptable. The problem is, it doesn't work. It doesn't achieve perfection. And yet, it forces them to insist that they're perfect, even when they're not, which is the next characteristic of all these collectivist states, which is they devote a tremendous amount of resources to propaganda. Okay? And because if you understand that there's a million different forms of collectivism, okay, you live in a country and this guy is in charge of your country and everyone does whatever he says, okay, you can say, well, maybe a better guy could be running our country. He can't live with that. He has to have a propaganda mechanism to convince you day and night, if you look at whether it's the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany or Venezuela for that matter. What you get is this constant stream of propaganda that we have hit perfection. Because if we haven't hit perfection, you're immediately going to question, why am I listening to this guy? He has to be perfect. Okay? If he's not perfect, the whole thing comes down like a house of cards. So socialism doesn't work, and yet has to, once it's in power, again, this is why they're never successful once they get in power, they have to spend their time and efforts convincing you that they're perfect. Because they can't allow the possibility that there could be something better here, because that brings it all down. Whereas a capitalist like me can say, this guy didn't do so well in business, it wasn't his thing, he needs to find a better business, he's better at it, people aren't perfect, we can live with that. Socialists can't live with that. I was reading that there's been a drought in Ethiopia. And the article said, there may be another famine in Ethiopia because of the drought. And I say, there may be a drought and there may be a famine. But the drought is not causing the famine. Socialism is causing the famine. Because every single famine in the history of the world has been caused, well, not in the history of the world, in the last 200 years, since the age of capitalism. Every single drought since the beginning of capitalism, in the last 200 years, has been caused by socialism. Every single famine, I'm trying to say. Can you think of a capitalist country that's had a famine?
No.
They've had a famine, they've had a drought in California for years now. But there's no famine. Why is that? Because it's capitalist. I know it's California, it's all socialism. But the fact is, California has enough capitalism to keep them from starving when there's a drought. Okay? Ethiopia does not. Ethiopia has a drought because things go up, there's imperfections all the time. Things go up and down all the time. Capitalist systems can deal with that. They may not like the drought, but they've got enough resource, enough flexibility via capitalism to solve the problem in California, not in Ethiopia. Okay? So the vagaries of nature affect all of us, but socialist societies are incapable of dealing with that. Capitalist societies are. So that is the nature of the beast. When you pull it all away, you simply have one person imposing his will on everyone else. So why is this popular? And there are several reasons, and I think most of these will ring true when we go through them. But we could talk about less stress and egalitarianism and security, just to begin with, okay? Because everybody's got stress. Life is stressful. I've got things to worry about. I oversleep. I'm late for work, and my boss yells at me. I got all this stress. And the socialist comes to me and says, how would you like to not be stressed? How would you just like to relax and know that everything's fine? You can just not have to worry about anything. It's very appealing from a very human perspective. The problem is it's also impossible from a human perspective. Human beings need stress. We depend on stress. Stress is what gets us out of bed in the morning. If I'm perfectly relaxed, I can just stay in bed all day and read a book. And I'd be totally happy. And I can, in a capitalist society, I can stay in bed all day. But I'll get poorer and poorer and poorer because I'm staying in bed all day. The socialist society needs people at their job, at work, every bit as much as the capitalist society does. But they don't have the soft force of incentive. They have to use hard force. Somebody in a socialist society is going to have to make you get out of bed. And that's the difference between socialism and capitalism right there. Okay? I've been telling people this for years. I kind of collect historical tidbits. And I was reading a book about Stalin's Soviet Union, and I came across a great example of this. Do you know what the penalty was in the Soviet Union under Stalin for being 10 minutes late to work?
Yeah.
Didn't matter what job you had. This is one socialist society. Okay, it's all the same rule book for everybody. A year in a concentration camp. Okay? A year in a gulag for being 10 minutes late to work. And your chance of surviving that year was maybe 30%. It was very, very pleasant in the concentration camp. So what are you going to tell me? There was no stress in the Soviet Union? You think there's no stress in North Korea? No stress in Cuba? I'm going to tell you, you don't know what stress is. You've never seen stress in your life compared to the kind of stress they have there. But again, it's sold that there's an absence of stress, and as long as you're never in power, you can convince your followers for 100 years after your death that there would have been no stress if only I had come to power. And then there's egalitarianism, which again is very popular. I blame our parents on this, because when I was a little kid, my mother scooped out the ice cream, equally. Everyone got the same amount, and I had to share my Halloween candy with my sister, and that was like the ethic of the house, where these things had to be equal. And I think we kind of grow up with this idea that things should be equal. I can't tell you how many people have come to me and said, why can't we just share everything equally? I think that's the question that Bernie Sanders would ask if he were here. Well, it's a very important answer. It's not a popular answer, it's an important answer. We're not equal. Human beings are the least equal species under the sun. We are amazingly unequal. There is nothing in the world compared to the inequality, inequality is the wrong word, the unequalness of individual human beings. Now it gets complex because we're unequal in a million different ways. Okay? Some people are smarter than other people. Some people are more industrious than other people. Some people, have more energy than other people. Some people have better people skills than other people. Some people are more organized. Some people are more creative. We could probably come up with a million different ways, a million different criteria, and we're unequal in all of them. And every single one of them relates to some way of earning a living. The fact is, what most of us do in life is we figure out what our strengths and weaknesses are and figure out a career path that will play to our strengths and not to our weaknesses. This is what high school guidance counselors, theoretically help you figure out how to do, is what you got and what you don't have. Now, does this all come out equal in the end? Nope. Nope, it doesn't. And moreover, it's all situational. It's all about the time and the place and the circumstances. Mark Zuckerberg is worth $20 billion in his 20s. In his 20s, he's got $20 billion because he invented Facebook. Had Mark Zuckerberg been born a Chinese peasant in the 12th century, would he have $20 billion? Pretty hard to figure out how he would have done that. He was at the right place at the right time with the right idea. But here's the thing, he actually did it. He produced Facebook. Literally billions of people around the world like and use Facebook every day. Okay? It's the reality. Okay? I didn't know people wanted Facebook. But he did. He had the insight and the skill to put this together, to deliver to people, and people liked what they got. To put this in terms of cosmic justice is to miss the point. It's not that Mark Zuckerberg is somehow cosmically, that his humanity is worth $20 billion, is that he created $20 billion worth of wealth that wasn't there before. He created something out of pretty much nothing. What are the raw ingredients that turned into Facebook? Okay, he created this wealth, and he's got it. So we are inherently unequal, and the whole logic of equality kind of checkmates itself, because you can't even try to achieve equality without using force. Is that not so? Is there anybody here who thinks that if you have a free society where no one is allowed to use force against anybody else, does anyone think the results are going to be equal? That we're all going to end up with the exact same amount of money? And I've never met anyone who would claim that. The only way you're going to get to equality is to use force. You're going to have to come in there and take the stuff away from this guy and give it to that guy. And who gets to use the force? Well, you're going to have a special group of people in that society who are empowered to use the force against everybody else. Is that not so? Are those guys equal? How can they be? They're allowed to use force, and the other people aren't. It's inherently contradictory. You can't work your way out of this box. Which is why there's never been an equal society in the history of the world. You think the Soviet Union was equal? They had special hospitals just for Communist Party members. You couldn't go to them unless you were a member of the Communist Party. There was no equality. Okay? There was simply somebody imposing his will on everybody else, which is all it's been, and all there's ever been. And then there's security. Sadly, people want to give up freedom in exchange for security all the time. It's a very depressing human instinct. But you don't get the security. When you give the freedom for security, you end up with neither. And I'll give you an example. People think you can make a law that says, no one will starve. It's a law. We won't let them starve. Well, what happens if there's not enough food? Somebody's going to starve and eat the law. Okay, what are you going to eat if there's not enough food? How does a law against starving possibly help you? Okay? Our security does not come from laws like that. Security comes from food. And the production of food largely comes from individual freedom, from people pursuing their own interests to produce food for themselves and to produce food for others. The North Korean Constitution, I bet you didn't know North Korea had a constitution. The North Korean Constitution, this is before Obamacare, the North Korean Constitution guarantees to every North Korean free medical care. They have a constitutional right to free medical care. Now, we don't get a whole lot of news out of North Korea. It's a very closed society. Occasionally, little details slip out. And I was reading a piece a couple of years ago that mentioned in North Korean hospitals, they don't have anesthesia. I mean, they're too poor, they don't have anesthesia. You know what they do instead of anesthesia? They have 4 big guys hold you down during your surgery. Okay? Now, personally, I would rather pay for my health care and get the anesthesia than get it for free and have 4 big guys hold you down. But the Constitution of North Korea doesn't say anything about anesthesia. It says free health care, which means you get what they got to give you. And that's all you're going to get. You can say this stuff. It's like the difference between words and reality. And there's a couple other perverse human instincts that are worth noting here. One is what I call the totalitarian within. And I think we all have this. It's a little voice in your head that says, my neighbor would be so much better off if he just lived his life my way. Is there anyone who doesn't think that somewhere, some of the time, okay? The problem is my neighbor is too dumb to understand that. If only I could just force him to live his life my way, then he'd be fine. In fact, eventually he'd come back and thank me. He'd say, I'm so lucky that you forced me to do things your way. Somewhere we all believed this. And it's interesting and it's funny, but it's also the root of all of this socialism and collectivism. Because the socialist comes to you and says, I'm going to fix your neighbor. And you're like, oh good, my neighbor really needs to be fixed. I've been waiting for you to come along and fix my neighbor. And of course he's telling the neighbor the same thing about you. Because this is how the socialists come to power. Okay? You want freedom, but freedom begins with a kind of a truce where we all agree to leave each other alone. Okay? Faults and all. Okay? You want to be free to run your life your way. You gotta grant that. You gotta grant that to everybody else. And that's because that instinct is also what leads to